Dr. Lisa Ryan, as Dr. Lisa Ryan has spent many years in the areas of obesity and sports nutrition. She is also head of the department in GMIT as well. And Dr. Lisa Ryan is going to be talking to us today about concussions, awareness, and training in sports. So without further ado, Lisa, you can take it away.
Great, thanks a million. Sorry, I'm still kind of fascinated after that talk. I found that so interesting. Thanks a million, Margaret. Right, I will just try and share my slides here, and hopefully, hopefully that's working. And I'll just get these up here now. Apologies. Yeah. Okay, one of the things I also realized while Margaret was talking was that I've probably attempted to do too much here, but my parents are from Cork and I've spent years in Cork, so I'm used to talking fast. So apologies in advance, but hopefully you'll stick with me. So as Kaylee said, most of my background has actually been predominantly in clinical trials. But for the last 5 years, I've been researching concussion, and I'll be taking you through all of that kind of process today, and some of my transition, I suppose, from kind of more quantitative focused research to qualitative. So just to give you a brief history about myself, I started off in UCC a good few years ago now. I did my primary degree and PhD down there, all in nutritional biochemistry, and I postdoc there for a few years. But after that, I went over to the UK, to Bournemouth University and then Oxford Brookes University, where I was running kind of sport and exercise programs as well as nutrition programs, but also set up some kind of clinical trial labs, and moved from there to Monash University in Australia. And then a few years ago, came here to GMIT, where I set up the sport and exercise and nutrition programs. So I spent, this is me at various stages in my career, and I thought other people would have put up embarrassing photos of themselves, but that hasn't happened. But these are examples of how I've transitioned through my career. So spent lots of times in labs, started off firstly looking very much at kind of cells, and then moved on to clinical trials in people because I was interested about the application of learning rather than kind of more theoretical kind of processes. But aside from everything that I was doing in kind of a work basis, I was always on the field. So I've played sport at quite a high level all through my life, and played both field hockey and also kickboxing, and was really fascinated about bringing these two interests together. So how does the body respond to exercise? How does nutrition play a role on how the body functions? And I managed then, alongside my academic career, to work with a number of different sports teams and clubs in Ireland originally, and then in the UK and Australia, and now back again in Ireland now that I'm here, kind of looking at firstly how you can manipulate their diet, but then started seeing a lot of the injuries that came through with some of the other problems, and began to kind of question how we might be able to support them. And as I grew the sport and exercise department here at GMIT, we started looking at this in a lot more detail. So as a first off disclaimer, I have to say I am a complete rugby fanatic, probably would be the best word. And anytime somebody hears that you're researching concussion, they often think it's because you're trying to dissuade people from playing the sport, but actually it's the exact opposite. I'm now part of a network of concussion researchers all around the world. We work with the UFC, we work with rugby clubs, we work with netball clubs, with field hockey, every kind of sport. And in fact, what you find is people are extremely collaborative in this area, because we all want people to play sport. We want people to keep on playing, people to be physically active, people to engage, and for parents not to be scared to send their kids off to a field. And that's what's really driving a lot of the research in this area. And it's all coming, the whole kind of focus, I suppose, is around player welfare. And there's been a lot in the media over the last year, in particular in concussion. And sometimes when it's in the media, it's great because it puts more awareness on the problem. But then sometimes it also makes people think that the problem is more prevalent maybe than it is. But the key factor with concussion is that in elite sport, there are plenty of medical people there, and they still struggle to diagnose concussion. But the main message, and this is one that you'll hear several times in this field, is if in doubt, sit it out. So if at any stage there is any doubt about a player or a child or an adolescent after they've had an on the head, the first thing to do is to stop that person engaging in activity and to let the brain rest. Why is this, and why does a concussion happen? Well, by definition, it's a complex reaction. So it's a head injury, and it can be mild or severe. And if you think about it rationally, it makes perfect sense why there would be brain damage when you get a knock, because we have this very rigid structure, the skull that goes around the brain, but the brain is very soft. And if there's a hit, or if there's what's called an inciting incident, the brain then will hit against the skull, and that can lead to some damage. But it's not just a direct hit. In fact, those kind of direct hits and those pictures that are always used by the media where somebody's very much out of it on a pitch are kind of the more obvious types of concussion to diagnose. But you can also get what are called subconcussive hits. And this is what we're hearing a lot more about, of course, from soccer, where somebody is hitting the ball regularly throughout their career, where it's not a diagnosed concussion, but that repeated hitting of the ball on the head is leading to a build-up of subconcussive events. And those over time can lead to trouble, not for everybody, but for some individuals. And so some of it can lead to bruising, swelling of the brain, tearing of nerves, etc. And again, this doesn't happen to everybody, but it does happen to some individuals. And there's a whole treatment process then if somebody ends up having a concussion. But then for the next few slides, I'm just going to take you through some of the questions that we had in this area, because this all started really through, I suppose, kind of a serendipity, really. I was working with a professional rugby team for kind of a whole holistic player approach, and we were looking at nutrition and psychology. And one of the things that we started off looking at is, firstly, how does workload impact on injury risk? So we weren't looking at workload and concussion, but we wanted to track how much workload the players were doing, and then for people that were doing too much or too little, how was that impacting maybe on their injury risk? Um, I've already had my disclaimer that I'm a rugby fanatic, and rugby, out of all of the sports, rugby has one of the highest incidence rates of injury. So if you want to keep your team successful, and if you're an Irish supporter, you want to make sure that your best players are out there. If you want to keep a team successful, one of the things you have to look at are your injury management strategies. And for those of you that do know a bit about sport, or if you've any kind of passing interest in sport, one of the ways that we manage workload is by measuring workload. So by workload, we simply mean all of the training that a player is doing. And there is a ratio that is used to calculate the work rate of somebody, which is called the acute chronic workload ratio, which basically just takes into account the totality of the training that athlete has been doing for the past 7 days compared to the totality of training that they've been doing for the last 28 days. And it's not a perfect model, and there are plenty of people that critique it, but it is used across sport, and it is a useful model to try and track how much work an athlete is doing. Now, it's very interesting because when you look at acute chronic workload ratios, there's what's called a sweet spot, but the sweet spot hasn't been identified for every sport. In fact, a lot of the research that we have in the acute chronic workload ratio is only coming from a small subset of sports. And what is really interesting to know is resting a player too much can be just as detrimental as working them too hard. So, for instance, the traditional regime for certainly the old style coaching would be, if you'd a loss at the weekend, coach would come out first training session after that match and would say they're going to run the legs off you, they're going to run you into the ground. But actually that can be really detrimental at times, because you may be causing what's called a spike in somebody's workload, and you could be putting certain players at risk. So what we do with certainly in professional teams and in sub-elite teams, we would measure the workload of every player on that team throughout pre-season, continue through the season, and plan where we want them to be in the workload cycle at different stages. So this is ensuring that your athletes will peak as well where you want them to. But one of the things that we then did was we worked with a professional rugby team, and we measured their workload over a 2-season period. And we then looked at, during that time, the players that became concussed and those that weren't concussed. Were there differences in their workload? And what we found was that in these rugby players, that there was a significant difference in the acute chronic workload ratio for concussed players versus those that weren't concussed. And there also were positional differences in the workload, i.e., comparing backs and forwards in rugby. And so this led us to think that maybe fatigue could be a factor when you think about concussion management. So maybe coaches might need to use this information to start managing the workload of players that are in positions at risk. Follow-on question then that we had, well, we know a bit about workload, and we know that perhaps we can manipulate workload to try and protect the players. But in Ireland, what are people's attitudes and knowledge on concussion? So last year then we put out a survey distributed it throughout Ireland, and we had a fairly good response rate. We had 438 who came back to us, and the inclusion criteria were basically that you had to either be a coach, an athlete, or a parent of a child that was playing sport. And so what we found there was that the athletes that had the most dangerous attitudes towards concussion, athletes had the most dangerous attitude towards concussion compared to coaches and compared to players, and that male rugby athletes in Ireland have suffered a dangerous number of concussions, with some of them having very, very high rates of concussion. Also noticed that the attitude towards concussion improved as people got older. So the younger subgroups had were much more likely to go back on the pitch following a concussion or not admit that they had a concussion compared to older ages. So as people age, they began to have kind of what we would consider a safer attitude towards concussion. We then moved, so a lot of our work, and most certainly my career to date has been very much quantitative and in a lab and doing a lot of analysis and a lot of data analysis. But over the last few years, we have focused on qualitative analysis, and it's been a huge learning experience for me personally to move into more of the qualitative world, but it's something that I've really enjoyed. And from a concussion point of view, it's really interesting because it is probably the best way to get a rounded view of people's experiences in concussion. So we sought retired professional players, rugby players, to find out their experiences about concussion. And we had responses from ex-professional players from Australia, from the UK, and throughout Ireland. And we engaged with 28 interviews, predominantly males. We opened it up to females as well, but we had very little engagement from females. So it's something that we're going to look at in the future. But we had 28 interviews and then thematically analyze them to see what were the players saying about their experiences in concussion. And the results were really, really interesting because we kind of categorized it into different areas. One, which is the public language that players would use. So you can see here some ideas around how the players were categorizing their concussion. They'll say they weren't knocked out. So if they weren't knocked out, they, and just a bit wobbly, thinking that that wasn't really a concussion, So really downplaying in the language that they were using some of the, when they clearly did have a concussion, but not recognizing that some of those symptoms, being dazed, feeling wobbly, etc., that was actually a concussion, because in their mind, being knocked out was the clear definition of a concussion. Some of the private language then and the private examples, and to be honest, for all of us that have been involved in this research, some of these have been really, really harrowing, some of these interviews with the players, but discussing some of the depression that people have suffered following a number of concussions, asking themselves if it's worth it. A number of players highlighted depression and anxiety later on in life, players that had a significant number of concussions. And then also tying in with that, we found that lots of players actively hide concussion, and and this goes on in the current setting, that players adapt, and have a number of different techniques to try and trick the system. And a number of players mentioned the pressure that they felt to hide concussions linked into their contracts. So in particular, if they had contracts coming up, they didn't want to be so-called injury prone, in which case they would really downplay their concussion. So then, following on from that, we knew a bit of that workload might have an impact on fatigue, which could be linked into concussion. We'd done a survey, we'd done a lot of qualitative analysis. We then started thinking about what are the ways that you can prevent a concussion. If we know that concussion can have all of these effects, are there ways to prevent it? And if you're in this field, lots of people would say, well, the best way to prevent a concussion is to strengthen the neck. And if you talk to any strength and conditioning coach and you ask them about concussion, this is probably one of the things that they're going to say to you: build up the neck to protect somebody against concussion. And there are lots of publications about this. If you do a quick search on the internet, even now, it'll tell you, yeah, one of the best ways to prevent concussion is to strengthen the neck. And when we spoke to those ex-pro players and we asked them, are there any strategies to prevent concussion? The majority of them mentioned, yeah, improving players' neck strength. We work on neck strength, and it's probably one of the ways to help from concussion. And here I have one of the researchers on the team when he had that moment of realizing that everything he'd been coaching for years is completely wrong, because over the last year, we did an analysis on this and we collated all of the evidence in the area. So did a systematic review and meta-analysis on every study so far on neck strength and concussion risk. And there is no evidence to support it at all. There is plenty of evidence to say that if you do training, you can strengthen the neck, but there's no evidence to suggest that that neck strengthening will actually protect